Some wounds never heal, they just teach us how to carry the pain with grace. In a world that seems to have forgotten what kindness looks like, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. An aging Apache warrior named Chogan rides alone through the Arizona desert, forgotten by his own people and haunted by a lifetime of loss. When he finds two small girls beside their burned homestead, the older child whispers words that cut deeper than any blade. "Please don't hurt us. We are already hurt." These children have no one left in the world except a man they should fear. But Chogan sees something in their eyes that reminds him of his own lost family. Now he must choose between the anger that has defined his life and the chance to save two innocent souls. Can an old warrior find peace by protecting the very people his world taught him to fight? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly under a copper sun that seemed to leach the very soul from the land. Heat waves danced across red earth that had drunk more blood than rain in the past decade, and the wind carried stories of sorrow in every grain of sand it stirred. This was 1882, a time when the map still had blank spaces, and those spaces were filled with fear. Chogan had been riding since dawn, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the tremor that sometimes visited them in quiet moments. At 63, he carried his years like stones in a medicine bag. Each one a weight, each one precious in its own wounded way. His horse, a paint mare named Sadie, picked her way carefully through the scattered bones of what had once been someone's dream of a new life. The homestead appeared through the shimmering heat like a mirage of despair. Adobe walls stood half-melted, their mud bricks softened by flames that had died days ago. The roof had collapsed inward, leaving blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some great beast. A well stood nearby, its wooden bucket hanging motionless, and a vegetable garden showed the brown remnants of what someone had lovingly tended until very recently. Chogan had seen this tableau too many times before. The pattern was always the same. Hope built with careful hands, then destroyed in a single night of violence. Whether by Apache raiders, cavalry soldiers, or desperate men driven mad by the sun, the end result never changed. Families scattered. To the wind, dreams buried in ash. But something was different here. A sound, soft as a mourning dove's call, drifted from behind the collapsed barn. Chogan's hand moved instinctively to the worn grip of his Colt revolver, then stopped. His Apache training had taught him to read the land like scripture, and this sound spoke of pain, not danger. He dismounted slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Age had settled into his bones like winter, making each day a negotiation between will and flesh. His moccasins made no sound as he approached the source of the crying, though he knew that stealth was probably unnecessary. Whatever waited for him had already lost too much to pose any threat. Behind the barn's ruins, huddled against a pile of scattered hay bales, he found them. Two small girls, their faces streaked with soot and tears, clung to each other with the desperate intensity of drowning swimmers. The older child, perhaps 6 years old, held her baby sister protectively, and both wore dresses that had once been white, but were now the color of smoke and grief. The older girl looked up as Chogan's shadow fell across them. Her eyes were the deep brown of river stones, far too old for her face. She had seen things no child should witness, and those experiences had carved lines of wisdom and wariness into her young features. Her hair, once blonde as wheat, hung in tangled strands around her dirt-stained cheeks. "Please don't hurt us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "We are already hurt." The words struck Chogan like a physical blow. He had heard many pleas for mercy in his lifetime, screamed in Apache, Spanish, and English, but none had ever carried such quiet dignity. This child was not begging. She was simply stating a fact, as if their suffering had reached a point where additional pain would be redundant. Chogan knelt slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. The motion sent sharp pains through his knees, but he ignored them. "I will not hurt you, little ones," he said in English, his voice rusty from disuse. He had not spoken to another human being in 3 weeks. The baby, perhaps 3 years old, peered at him from behind her sister's shoulder. Her eyes were the same brown, but still held some spark of curiosity that her sister had lost. She clutched a torn doll to her chest, its stuffing leaking from multiple wounds like cotton blood. "Where is your family?" Chogan asked gently. The older girl's chin trembled, but she lifted it with fierce pride. "Gone. The men with blue coats came 3 days ago. They said Papa owed them money, but Papa said we didn't have any money. They got angry and—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. Chogan felt a familiar darkness stir in his chest. Blue coats meant cavalry, though that could mean anything from legitimate soldiers to deserters turned bandit. The distinction mattered little to the dead. He looked around the destroyed homestead with new eyes, noting details he had missed before. The violence here had been personal, methodical. This was not the work of raiders looking for quick profit, but of men who had taken their time with their cruelty. "What are your names?" he asked. "I'm Paloma," the older girl said. "This is Esperanza. Mama named her that because she said every baby is hope." Her voice caught on the word hope, as if the concept had become foreign to her. Paloma, dove. A name chosen in expectation of peace, in a world that had shown her only violence. Esperanza. Hope. Perhaps her mother had possessed the kind of faith that could see light, even in the darkest places. "I am called Chogan," he said. "It means blackbird in my language." "Are you Apache?" Paloma asked, with the directness that only children possess. "Yes." She studied his face carefully. "Mama said some Apache were good and some were bad, just like white people. She said judging a whole people by the actions of a few was what started all the trouble out here." Her mother had been wiser than most. Chogan felt a pang of regret for the woman he would never meet, who had tried to raise her daughters with understanding rather than hatred. Such wisdom was rare in this territory, where fear and prejudice grew like desert thorns, choking out compassion. "Your mama was a smart woman," he said. "She was the smartest woman in the whole world." Esperanza spoke for the first time, her voice small but fierce. Chogan smiled, the first genuine smile his face had worn in months. "I believe that," he said. He looked around the ruins again, calculating. The girls had been here for 3 days without food or water, surviving on whatever they could scavenge. That they were still alive spoke to either remarkable luck or remarkable resilience. Probably both. The desert was no place for children, especially not with winter approaching. Despite the day's heat, the nights were already turning cold, and within weeks the first snows would dust the higher elevations. These girls would not survive another week without help, and help was not likely to come. This homestead was miles from the nearest settlement, on land that most sensible people avoided, but taking them with him would bring its own dangers. Chogan was not welcome among his own people, having been cast out years ago for reasons that still burned like acid in his memory. The white settlements would view him with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst. A lone Apache traveling with 2 white children would raise questions he was not prepared to answer. Yet looking at Paloma and Esperanza, he saw echoes of his own lost family. His wife, Ayana, had possessed the same quiet strength he saw in the older girl. His daughter, who would have been about Paloma's age now, had shared Esperanza's bright curiosity. They had been taken from him in the space of a single terrible night, victims of the same cycle of violence that had claimed these girls' parents. Perhaps this was his chance. Not for revenge, which had consumed him for so long, but for something else. Something that might finally quiet the voices of the dead that whispered to him in the long hours before dawn. "Can you ride a horse?" he asked Paloma. She nodded. "Papa taught me. I can help Esperanza too." Good. We cannot stay here. This place holds too much sorrow, and winter is coming. I know where we can find safety." It was only partially true. He knew of an Apache settlement hidden in the Dragoon Mountains, led by a woman who had once been kind to him. Whether she would still extend that kindness after all these years remained to be seen, but it was their only chance. As he helped the girls gather their few possessions, Chogan caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Boot prints in the dust near the well, too fresh to be from the original attack. Someone had been here recently, watching, waiting. The cavalry unit that had destroyed this family was still in the area. He said nothing to alarm the children, but his hand moved to check his revolver again. The weapon felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that he might soon need it. He had hoped his days of violence were behind him, but the desert had its own laws, and mercy was not among them. As they rode away from the ruins, Esperanza, clutching her torn doll, and Paloma sitting straight-backed with dignity beyond her years, Chogan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. These children were under his protection now, and he would die before he let any harm come to them. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ashes of someone else's dreams. Ahead lay the promise of sanctuary, if they could survive long enough to reach it. And somewhere in between, in the vast expanse of unforgiving desert, rode the men who had created all this grief and might not be finished with their work. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In the gathering twilight, three unlikely companions began a journey that would test everything Chogan believed about redemption, family, and the possibility of peace in a world that seemed to have forgotten what the word meant. The truth came to Chogan in pieces, like a puzzle assembled by the desert wind. As they made camp that first night, hidden in a grove of mesquite trees, he studied the girls more carefully by firelight. Paloma's dress bore stains that were not all ash and dust. Some were the rusty brown of dried blood. Esperanza's doll, he now saw, had been deliberately mutilated, not torn by accident but slashed with a knife in small, cruel cuts. "Paloma," he said gently, stirring the rabbit stew he had prepared, "can you tell me more about the men in blue coats?" The girl's hands stilled on her sister's hair, which she had been braiding with the patience of someone far older. There were 4 of them. The leader had yellow hair and a scar here. She traced a line down her left cheek. "He said Papa owed the army money for supplies, but Papa showed him the papers that said everything was paid for." Chogan's jaw tightened. He had known many cavalry officers, had served alongside some, and fought against others. A legitimate dispute over supplies would be handled through proper channels, not by burning down homesteads in the middle of the night. What happened then? The yellow-haired man got angry. He said Papa was calling him a liar. Papa said he wasn't. He just wanted to show the papers, but the man knocked Papa down and told the other soldiers to search the house. Paloma's voice remained steady, but her hands shook slightly as she continued braiding. "They broke things. Mama's dishes, Papa's books. They were looking for money, but we didn't have any hidden money." Esperanza had fallen asleep against her sister's shoulder, exhausted by the day's ride and the simple comfort of feeling safe enough to rest. Her torn doll lay in her lap, its button eyes staring blindly at the fire. When they didn't find money, the yellow-haired man said Papa must be hiding it somewhere else. He said they would make him remember where. Paloma stopped braiding and looked directly at Chogan. "That's when Papa told us to run and hide in the root cellar. We could hear them hurting Papa, and Mama was screaming, and then everything got quiet except for the fire." Chogan fed another piece of wood to the flames, buying time to control his anger. He had seen the aftermath of such interrogations before. These men had tortured an innocent family to death over a debt that likely never existed. They were deserters or criminals wearing stolen uniforms, using military authority as cover for robbery and murder. "Did you see them leave?" he asked. "We stayed in the root cellar until morning. When we came out, everything was burned and Papa and Mama were—" She shuddered. We covered them with stones from the garden wall. I said a prayer like Mama taught me, a 6-year-old child burying her parents with her own small hands. Chogan had to look away from her face, afraid she would see the depth of his rage and mistake it for anger directed at her. "You are very brave, little dove," he said. "I'm not brave," Paloma replied matter-of-factly. "I'm just doing what Mama would want me to do. Take care of Esperanza and try to find someone good to help us." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Esperanza stirred and mumbled something in her sleep. Chogan caught the word "Papa" and felt his chest tighten. These children would carry scars from this trauma for the rest of their lives, but at least they would have lives to carry them through. That was something. The next morning brought an early frost and the sound that would haunt Chogan's dreams for years to come, the distant jingle of cavalry spurs and the creak of military saddles. He was up and moving before full consciousness. Returned years of survival instinct overriding the stiffness in his joints. "Get up," he whispered urgently, shaking the girls awake. "We must go. Now." Paloma was instantly alert, the hypervigilance of trauma keeping her senses sharp. "Is it them?" she asked. "I don't know, but we cannot take that chance." They broke camp in minutes, leaving no trace of their presence except cold ashes that could have been from any traveler's fire. Chogan lifted both girls onto his horse and led them deeper into the maze of arroyos and rock formations that characterized this part of the territory. Here, the Apache way of moving through landscape would serve them well, but their pursuers were persistent. Throughout the morning, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The ring of horseshoes on stone, the occasional curse when a mount stumbled, the metallic clink of equipment. These were not the sounds of a patrol following standard routes. These men were hunting. It was Esperanza who spotted them first. "Men on horses," she said, pointing back along their trail. 4 men. Chogan's blood turned to ice water. 4 riders matched Paloma's description exactly. The same men who had murdered the girl's family were now tracking the only witnesses to their crime. "Can we hide?" Paloma asked. "Not here. Too much open ground." Chogan scanned the terrain ahead, his tactical mind working through possibilities. To the north lay the Chiricahua Mountains, with caves and canyons that could hide them for weeks. But that was a hard day's ride, and their pursuers were mounted on military horses, faster and stronger than his aging paint mare. That left the southern route toward the border, but that way lay only more desert and the ever-present danger of federales who shot Apache on sight. Or they could stand and fight. Chogan's hand drifted to the leather pouch tied to his belt, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were the pigments he had once used to paint his face for war. Red ochre for courage, white clay for death, black charcoal for the darkness that lived in a warrior's heart. He had not opened that pouch in 5 years, had hoped never to need it again. The choice was taken from him when the first rifle shot echoed across the desert floor. The bullet struck a rock 20 yards to their left, sending chips of stone flying. Chogan's horse shied and nearly threw all 3 of them before he regained control. "Paloma, listen to me," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Take Esperanza and go to those boulders over there. Get behind them and stay down. Do not look up, do not call out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand? What about you? I'm going to remind these men why their grandfathers feared the Apache." He helped them down from the horse and watched them run to cover, Paloma half carrying, her little sister with strength born of desperation. Only when they were safely hidden did Chogan turn to face his pursuers. The 4 riders approached at a careful canter, spread out in a classic military formation. Their leader was indeed blonde, with a thick scar running down his left cheek, like Paloma had described. His uniform bore the insignia of a lieutenant, but something in his bearing suggested the rank was either stolen or bought rather than earned through service. "Well, well," the scarred man called out as they drew within speaking distance. "An old Indian playing nursemaid to white children. How touching." Chogan said nothing, but his hand moved to open the war paint pouch. The familiar textures of the pigments felt strange after so many years, like greeting old friends he had hoped never to see again. Those girls saw something they shouldn't have seen, the lieutenant continued. We can't have witnesses running around, telling tales. You understand? I understand that you are murderers and cowards, Chogan replied, beginning to paint the ancient symbols on his cheeks with steady fingers. I understand that you killed an innocent family for money they did not have. The lieutenant's face darkened. Careful, old man, you're outnumbered 4-1. Chogan finished the war paint and looked up at his enemies. For the first time in years, he felt the cold clarity that came with accepting death as a possible outcome. It was strangely peaceful. You are mistaken, he said quietly. I am not outnumbered. I am Chogan of the Chiricahua Apache. I have killed more men than you have seen in your pitiful lives, and now I have something worth protecting which makes me more dangerous than all of you combined. He drew his revolver in one smooth motion and put a bullet through the lieutenant's heart before the man could react. The other 3 soldiers scrambled for their weapons, but Chogan was already moving, using his horse as cover while he picked his targets with the patience of a hunter taking game. When the shooting stopped, 4 men lay dead in the desert dust, and Chogan stood among them with blood on his hands and peace in his heart. He had chosen his side in this war, and it was not the side of vengeance or tribal loyalty. It was the side of 2 small girls who deserved a chance to grow up in a world less cruel than the one that had orphaned them. Is it over? Paloma's voice came from behind the rocks. Yes, little dove, it is over. The desert absorbed the violence like it had absorbed countless others before it, leaving only the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Chogan methodically searched the dead soldiers' saddlebags, finding supplies they would need and evidence of crimes that extended far beyond the murder of one family. Why did they want to hurt us? Esperanza asked as she emerged from behind the rocks, still clutching her torn doll. The shooting had not frightened her as much as Chogan had expected, perhaps because she had already seen the worst that men could do. Some people's hearts get sick, Chogan explained, kneeling to her level. When that happens, they start seeing enemies everywhere, even where there are none. Paloma approached more cautiously, her eyes taking in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned not to trust in safety. Will more soldiers come looking for them? These were not real soldiers, Chogan said, showing her the papers he had found. They were deserters, thieves wearing stolen uniforms. No one will come looking for them because they were already running from the law. Among the papers was a map marking other homesteads in the territory, with notes written in a crude hand about which families might have money or valuables worth taking. The lieutenant and his men had been working their way through isolated settlements, using their military disguises to gain trust before striking. The girl's family had simply been their most recent victims. Chogan burned the papers, sending their smoke up to join the endless blue of the desert sky. Some knowledge was too poisonous to preserve. They traveled south through the afternoon, following game trails that wound between towering saguaro cacti and ocotillo plants whose red blooms stood like flames against the pale earth. Chogan shared the trail with creatures who had learned, like him, to be patient and careful, roadrunners that paused to study them with bright eyes before darting away, coyotes that watched from distant ridges, and rattlesnakes that announced their presence with honest warnings. Tell me about your mama and papa, Chogan said as they walked, leading his horse to spare the animal's strength. Both girls rode now, Esperanza secure in her sister's arms. Papa came from Missouri, Paloma said. He was a teacher there, but he said the war made it hard to keep teaching because everyone was too angry to learn, so we came west to start over. Papa said the territory needed schools and Mama could start a garden and maybe we could have a farm where children could come to learn reading and arithmetic. Mama made the best cornbread in the whole world, Esperanza added solemnly, and she sang songs while she worked. Papa said her voice could make the corn grow taller. Chogan found himself smiling at the image of this family, a teacher and his Wife, carrying education and music into the wilderness like seeds that might take root and grow into something beautiful. They had been the kind of settlers who came not to conquer, but to build, not to take, but to give. Their murder was not just a crime against them, but against the future they had represented. "What about your family?" Paloma asked with the directness of childhood. "Do you have children?" The question struck deeper than any bullet could have. Chogan was quiet for so long that Paloma began to worry she had said something wrong. "I had a wife," he said finally. "Her name was Aitana. It means glory. And I had a daughter, Kitlali. Star. They were killed 7 years ago." "By soldiers?" Paloma asked softly. "Yes, but not like the ones who came to your home. These were real soldiers, following real orders." He paused, weighing how much truth a child could bear. There had been raids on settlements. Some Apache warriors, angry and desperate, had attacked wagon trains and ranches. The army decided to punish all Apache, not just the ones who had done wrong. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft plod of hooves and the whisper of wind through the girl's hair. Finally, Esperanza spoke up. "Is that why you were alone? Because you were sad?" "Yes, little star. I was very sad. For a long time I thought the sadness would never end." "But it did end?" Paloma asked hopefully. Chogan considered this. Had it ended? The crushing weight of grief that had followed him like his own shadow for 7 years felt somehow lighter since he had found these children. Not gone. He suspected it would never be completely gone, but transformed into something more bearable. "It is ending," he said carefully. "Sadness like that doesn't disappear all at once. It fades slowly, like winter snow melting in spring. But taking care of you and Esperanza helps. It reminds me that there is still goodness in the world worth protecting." As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the desert, in shades of gold and crimson, they made camp beside a small spring hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. The water was clear and cold, fed by underground streams that remembered a time when this land was green and abundant. Chogan taught the girls to gather tender, prickly pear pads, showing them how to use a stick to remove the spines and a knife to peel away the tough skin. "The Apache have lived in this desert for many generations," he explained as they worked. "We learned to find food and water where others see only emptiness." "Will you teach us more Apache ways?" Paloma asked, carefully, following his demonstration. "If you wish to learn, knowledge is a gift that grows larger when it is shared." Esperanza found a smooth stone near the spring and showed it to Chogan with excitement. "Look, it has a hole in it like a window." "That is very special," Chogan said, examining the stone seriously. "My people believe that stones with natural holes can help you see things that are hidden. You should keep it safe." She slipped the stone into her doll's torn dress, patting it protectively. Now maybe she can see good dreams instead of bad ones. That night, as the girls slept curled together under a blanket Chogan had taken from the soldiers' supplies, he sat by the dying fire and contemplated the path ahead. The settlement he remembered in the Dragoon Mountains was still 3 days away, assuming it still existed. Much could change in the years since he had been cast out from his people. But first, there was something he needed to do, something that had been weighing on his conscience since the moment he had pulled his gun and chosen violence over peaceful solutions. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was his war paint pouch, but also other items he had not touched in years. A carved bone awl that had belonged to his wife, a small medicine bundle blessed by the tribal elders, and a piece of turquoise his daughter had found on the day before she died. He held each item carefully, remembering the hands that had touched them, the love that had blessed them. For 7 years, he had carried these things as monuments to his grief, talismans of loss that kept his anger sharp and his purpose clear. But now, looking at 2 small girls who slept peacefully because they trusted him to keep them safe, he wondered if it was time to let these objects serve a different purpose. Tomorrow they would continue south toward whatever sanctuary he could find or make. Tonight he would begin the slow process of teaching his heart to hope again. The second day brought clouds and the promise of rain, rare gifts in this parched land. Esperanza woke with a fever that sent ice through Chogan's veins. He had seen too many children claimed by the desert's harsh embrace to take any illness lightly. Her small face was flushed and she whimpered softly when Paloma tried to rouse her for the morning meal. "She's burning up," Paloma said, her voice tight with fear. "Is she going to die like Mama and Papa?" "No," Chogan said with more certainty than he felt. "She will not die, but we must help her fight this sickness." He knelt beside the child and gently felt her forehead and neck, searching for signs of what might be wrong. Her breathing was labored but not dangerously so, and her skin felt hot but not the terrible heat that spoke of life leaving the body. This was likely the result of exhaustion, exposure, and the trauma her small system had endured. From his medicine bundle, Chogan withdrew packets of herbs he had gathered over the years: willow bark for fever, desert sage for cleansing, and sacred tobacco for prayers. The old ways were still strong in him, passed down through generations of healers who had learned to read the land's pharmacy. "What are you doing?" Paloma asked, watching him prepare the medicines with careful attention. "Making tea to help her." "Feel better. My grandmother taught me these things when I was younger than you are now. She said the earth provides everything we need to heal if we know how to ask properly." He built up the fire and set water to boil in a metal cup taken from the soldiers' supplies. As the flames danced, he began to sing, not loudly, but in the soft, rhythmic way his people had always sung healing songs. The words were in Apache, ancient syllables that carried the weight of countless prayers for sick children. "What are you singing?" Paloma whispered. "I am asking the spirits to help Esperanza's body remember how to be strong. I am telling them that she is precious, that she brings light to a dark world, and that we need her to stay with us." The tea, when it was ready, smelled of mountain meadows and summer rain. Chogan cooled it carefully and coaxed Esperanza to take small sips, supporting her head with gentle hands. She made a face at the bitter taste, but did not refuse it. Trust in him had already grown deep enough that she would accept his medicine even when it was unpleasant. "Will the spirits really help her?" Paloma asked. Chogan considered his answer carefully. "The spirits help those who help themselves. The tea will bring down her fever and ease her breathing. The song reminds us all, including Esperanza, that she is surrounded by love and care. Sometimes that is the strongest medicine of all." By midday, the fever had broken. Esperanza sat up and asked for water, then for food, and finally insisted that her doll needed some of the healing tea as well. Chogan solemnly prepared a tiny portion and helped her give it to the torn toy, understanding that children's rituals were as important as any adult ceremony. "She feels better now, too," Esperanza announced with satisfaction. The spirits helped her remember how to be strong. As they prepared to continue their journey, Chogan noticed riders approaching from the east, 3 figures on horseback, moving at an easy pace that suggested they were not in pursuit of anyone. Still, his hand moved instinctively toward his weapon until he could determine their intentions. The lead rider was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided down her back and skin weathered by decades under the desert sun. She wore a mixture of Mexican and American clothing, leather boots, cotton skirt, and a woolen shawl that spoke of practical choices made by someone who lived between worlds. "Buenos dias," she called out as she approached, raising one hand in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. "Good day," Chogan replied in English, noting that his 2 companions carried themselves like people accustomed to danger, but currently at ease. The woman studied him with intelligent eyes, taking in his Apache features, his travel-worn clothes, And the two small girls who pressed close to his sides. Her expression was curious, but not hostile. "I am Isabella Santos," she said. "This is my husband Miguel and my son Carlos. We run the trading post at Dos Rios, about 10 miles south of here." "Are you traveling far?" "Far enough," Chogan replied diplomatically. "I am Chogan. These are Paloma and Esperanza. We seek safety and shelter." Isabella's gaze lingered on the children, noting their pale skin and blonde hair, so different from Chogan's Apache features. "They are not your blood children," she observed. "Without judgment, no. But they are my responsibility now." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The world creates many kinds of families. Blood is only one way to be connected." She paused, then continued. "We heard gunshots yesterday. From the north. Was that your doing?" Chogan weighed his options. Lying might provide temporary safety, but these people struck him as honest traders who survived by reading character accurately. If they meant harm, they would hardly have approached so openly. "4 men were hunting us," he said simply. "They will not hunt anyone again." "Soldados!" Miguel spoke for the first time, his accent thick but his English clear. "Dressed as soldiers, but thieves and murderers, not real military men." Carlos, who looked to be about 16, whistled softly. "The ones with the scar-faced leader? We heard rumors about them. Several homesteads hit in the past month." "Those rumors were true," Chogan confirmed. "But the threat is ended now." Isabella exchanged glances with her husband and son, some silent communication passing between them. "You are welcome at our trading post," she said finally. "The children look like they could use a proper meal and a safe place to rest. And you," she studied Chogan's face, "you look like a man carrying heavy burdens. Perhaps we can lighten the load, at least for one night." The offer was tempting, but Chogan hesitated. "I do not wish to bring trouble to your door." "Trouble has a way of finding us, whether we invite it or not," Miguel said with a slight smile. "Better to face it with friends than alone." As they rode toward Dos Rios, Esperanza chattering happily with Carlos about his horse, and Paloma maintaining her watchful silence, Chogan found himself thinking about the nature of sanctuary. He had spent years believing that safety could only be found in isolation, in avoiding all contact with others who might judge or betray him. But perhaps true sanctuary was not about hiding from the world. Perhaps it was about finding the right people to stand with when the world showed its teeth. The trading post sat in a valley where 2 seasonal streams converged, creating a pocket of green in the endless brown. Adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard where chickens pecked at scattered grain, and a dog dozed in the afternoon shade. It was the kind of place that survived by serving all comers, Apache, Mexican, American, and the mixed blood. Families who belonged fully to none of these groups, but created their own communities in the spaces between. "We have a room where the children can sleep safely," Isabella said as they dismounted. "And Miguel makes the best pozole this side of Sonora. You are all welcome here." That night, as Paloma and Esperanza slept on clean bedding for the first time since their ordeal began, Chogan sat with his hosts around a fire in the courtyard. The pozole had been as good as advertised, thick with hominy and pork, seasoned with chilies that brought tears to his eyes and warmth to his belly. "Where are you taking them?" Isabella asked directly. "North, to the Dragoon Mountains. There is a settlement there where they might be safe." "Apache settlement?" Miguel asked. "Yes, though I am not certain of my welcome there. It has been many years since I was cast out from my people." Isabella studied his face in the firelight. "A man does not get cast out for small reasons. But a man also does not risk everything to save children unless his heart has found its way back to goodness. Sometimes the path to redemption leads us exactly where we need to be." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and Chogan suspected she spoke from her own journey through darkness toward light. The trading post itself was evidence of such a journey, a place where different worlds met and found common ground, built by people who understood that survival often meant choosing cooperation over conflict. The Apache and the Dragoons, Carlos, I said thoughtfully, is that the group led by the woman they call Itzel the Wise? Chogan's heart skipped. You know of her? She comes here sometimes to trade, brings medicinal herbs and beautifully woven baskets in exchange for metal tools and coffee. She is formidable, but fair. If she remembers you kindly, you will be welcomed. If not, he shrugged expressively. I will face whatever welcome I deserve, Chogan said quietly. These children need safety more than I need forgiveness. As the fire burned down to coals, and the desert night settled around them like a familiar blanket, Chogan felt something he had not experienced in years, the simple comfort of human companionship freely given. These strangers had opened their home to him based on nothing more than his word and their own generous hearts. It was a reminder that goodness still existed in the world, even in places where violence seemed to rule. Tomorrow, they would continue, north, toward an uncertain reception and an unknown future. But tonight, for the first time since he had found two small girls crying in the ruins of their lives, Chogan allowed himself to believe that their story might have a happy ending. The Dragoon Mountains rose from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, their granite faces scarred by wind and time into formations that resembled sleeping giants and crouching animals. As they climbed the winding trails that led into the high country, Chogan felt the weight of memory pressing down on him like the thin air at altitude. It had been here, in these same mountains, that he had first learned to be a warrior. Here that he had taken his first scalp. Here that he had fallen in love with Aitana during a celebration dance that lasted 3 days. And here, in a hidden canyon that held the bones of his ancestors, that his life had shattered like pottery. Dropped on stone. It's beautiful, Paloma said, looking out over the valley they had climbed from. The trading post was a distant speck now, and the desert stretched away toward horizons that shimmered with heat and possibility. My people have lived in these mountains for more generations than there are stars in the sky, Chogan said. Every rock and tree holds stories. Some are happy stories, some are not. Esperanza, riding in front of him on the saddle, twisted around to look up at his face. What kind of story are we making right now? The question caught him off guard with its simple wisdom. I think we are making a story about how broken things can sometimes be mended, little star. How people who have lost their families can find new ones. Good, she said with satisfaction. I like happy stories better than sad ones. They rounded a bend in the trail and came suddenly upon a sight that made Chogan's breath catch in his throat. The ruins of his old village spread across a natural shelf in the mountainside, adobe walls melted by rain and wind into shapes that barely suggested their former purpose. Weeds grew through cracked foundations, and small animals had made homes in what had once been the heart of a thriving community. What happened here? Paloma asked quietly, sensing the weight of grief that hung over the place like smoke. This was my home, Chogan said simply. 7 years ago, soldiers came. They said some Apache had been raiding settlements to the south, and that all Apache must be punished for the crimes of a few. They gave us 1 hour to gather our belongings and leave. Those who refused, he gestured toward a section of ruins that bore the black stains of fire. Those who refused were killed. He dismounted and helped the girls down, then stood for a long moment, looking at what remained of the life he had once known. There, beneath a collapsed roof, had stood his home. There, where twisted metal now lay scattered, Aitana had kept her loom. And there, in the shadow of a lightning-struck pine tree, Sitlali had played with dolls made from corn husks and scraps of cloth. I'm sorry, Paloma said, slipping her small hand into his. I'm sorry they hurt your family too. The simple sympathy of a child who understood loss broke something loose in Chogan's chest. He knelt and pulled both girls close, feeling tears he had not shed for years begin to burn behind his eyes. "We are all sorry together," he whispered, "and that makes us strong." Esperanza wriggled free and ran to pick up something that caught her eye among the ruins, a piece of pottery painted with geometric designs in red and black. "Look! Someone made this with their hands. It's still pretty, even though it's broken." She was right. The shard was beautiful, a fragment of someone's daily life transformed by loss into something that spoke of resilience and the enduring nature of human creativity. Chogan took it from her gently and studied the familiar patterns. "My wife made this," he said wonderingly. "This was part of a water jar she painted the summer before Sitlali was born." He turned the shard in the light, remembering Aitana's patient hands as she worked the clay, humming softly while their unborn child grew in her belly. "Can we fix it?" Esperanza asked. "The jar is too broken to mend," Chogan said, "but we can remember the hands that made it and the love that went into every line. Sometimes that is enough." A sound from the trail above made him look up sharply, the soft whistle that Apache used to signal their approach to a camp. Chogan's hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped as a familiar figure emerged from the rocks. She was smaller than he remembered, her hair now more silver than black, but her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had made her the most respected elder in the tribe. Itzel the Wise stood at the edge of the ruins, studying him with the penetrating gaze that had always seemed to see through flesh and bone to the truth beneath. "Chogan," she said simply, "you have returned." "Itzel," he inclined his head respectfully, "I have brought children who need protection." Her gaze moved to Paloma and Esperanza, taking in their pale skin, their blonde hair, their clean but travel-worn clothes. "White children? Orphaned children?" Chogan corrected. "Their parents were murdered by the same kind of men who destroyed this village. I could not let them die alone in the desert." Itzel studied his face for a long moment, reading things there that others might miss. "You have changed," she observed. "The anger that consumed you when you left us, where has it gone?" Chogan looked down at the pottery shard in his hands, then at the two girls who stood close beside him, trusting him to protect them from a world that had shown them little mercy. "It has not gone," he said honestly, "but it has been transformed. I'm still angry at injustice, at cruelty, at the waste of innocent life. But I no longer wish to answer death with more death. These children have taught me that building something new is harder than destroying what already exists. But it is also more important." "Wise words," Itzel said. "Perhaps exile has been good. For you." She moved closer, her steps careful on the uneven ground. "Our new village is a day's walk from here, in a canyon that is hidden from soldiers and raiders. You are welcome there, if you can live by our laws and contribute to our survival." "And the children?" Itzel knelt before Paloma and Esperanza, meeting, their eyes with the solemnity she would show any adult. "What are your names, little ones?" "I'm Paloma," the older girl said with quiet dignity. "This is Esperanza. Chogan saved us when bad men wanted to hurt us." "Chogan is a good man," Itzel said seriously. "Even when he forgot that about himself, others remembered. You have chosen your protector well." She stood and looked at Chogan. "Children who have lost their families need new families. We have room in our hearts and our homes for 2 more daughters." As they prepared to leave the ruins behind, Chogan placed the pottery shard carefully in his medicine bundle. It would rest there beside the other treasures of his past. But now it would serve a different purpose, not as a monument to grief, but as a reminder that beautiful things, even broken ones, could inspire others to create beauty of their own. The new Apache settlement nestled in a box canyon like a secret whispered to the mountains. Adobe homes built into natural caves provided protection from both weather and discovery, while terraced gardens carved from the canyon walls spoke of a people determined to thrive despite exile. A stream ran down the center of the canyon, fed by hidden springs that made this refuge possible. As they descended into the village, Chogan felt the weight of curious eyes upon them. Children peered around doorways before darting back to whisper excitedly to their parents. Women paused in their weaving to study the newcomers. Men working with tools and leather straightened to watch their approach. Everyone knew his story. The warrior who had been cast out for questioning the wisdom of endless warfare, who had disappeared into the desert to nurse his grief and rage. "They remember you," Itzel observed, noting his tension. "Some with kindness, others with suspicion. Time will show them which memory serves the truth better." Paloma pressed closer to Chogan's side as they walked. The attention made her nervous, though she tried to hide her fear behind the mask of composure that had become her shield against an unpredictable world. "Why are they staring?" Esperanza asked with the directness of childhood. "Because you are new," Itzel explained patiently, "and because your skin is different from ours. Some of our people have only known white faces as enemies. They must learn that children are children, regardless of what their parents looked like." An elderly man emerged from one of the larger dwellings, his face creased by decades of desert, sun, and hard decisions. Chogan recognized him as Cochise's nephew, a man who had always favored negotiation over warfare, but had the steel to fight when diplomacy failed. "Chogan," the man said, his tone carefully neutral, "I am surprised to see you return." "Hello, Nazario. I am surprised to be here." Nazario's gaze moved to the children, and his expression softened slightly. "These are the orphans Itzel mentioned. Their parents were murdered by false soldiers," Chogan said. "I found them dying in the desert and could not leave them to the vultures. And you brought them here, to us." Nazario studied his face. "Why? You could have taken them to any missionary or settlement. Why risk returning to people who cast you out?" It was a fair question, one that Chogan had been asking himself throughout their journey. "Because," he said slowly, "I remembered that before we learned to hate, our people knew how to heal. These children need healing more than they need revenge." A woman emerged from the crowd that had gathered, tall and stern, with graying hair braided with silver ornaments that marked her as a medicine woman. Chogan recognized her as Xochitl, one of Itzel's most trusted advisors. "You speak of healing," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being heard. "But you brought death with you to our mountains. The bodies of 4 soldiers lie 3 days' ride from here, killed by your hand." Murmurs ran through the crowd. News traveled fast in the desert, carried by traders and travelers who shared information like water in a drought. "I brought justice," Chogan replied. "Those men murdered this child's parents and were hunting them to eliminate witnesses. Would you have me let them succeed? You could have found another way. Violence always breeds more violence." Paloma stepped forward, surprising everyone. "He saved us," she said in a clear voice that carried despite her youth. "Those men wanted to kill me and my sister because we saw them hurt our mama and papa. Chogan could have just ridden away, but he didn't. He protected us, even though it was dangerous for him." The crowd fell silent at this testimony from one so young. Children did not lie about such things, and the dignity with which she spoke impressed even the skeptics. Itzel nodded approvingly. "From the mouths of children comes truth that adults often cannot hear. This man chose protection over safety, justice over peace. In our tradition there is honor in such choices." "And what of the future?" Xochitl asked. "More soldiers will come looking for their dead comrades. You have brought war to our doorstep." "I brought 2 children who need homes and a man seeking redemption," Itzel said firmly. "If war comes, it will be because it was already coming. Our choice is whether we face it as a community or as scattered individuals." As the day progressed, Chogan watched the village's response to their presence evolve from suspicion to curiosity to tentative acceptance. Children, as children do, adapted fastest. By evening, Esperanza was playing with Apache youngsters in a game that required no common language, only laughter and quick feet. Paloma remained more reserved, but she accepted food offered by various families and answered questions about her journey with quiet grace. That night, As cooking fires painted the canyon walls with dancing shadows, Itzel invited Chogan to sit with her outside her dwelling. From her medicine bundle, she withdrew a collection of smooth stones, each one carved with symbols that told stories of the tribe's history. "Do you remember these?" she asked, laying them out in a pattern that seemed random but carried deep meaning. "The teaching stones. You use them to help us understand our place in the great web of life. This one," she touched a stone marked with a spiral, "represents the cycle of seasons. This one, a stone bearing the image of a broken arrow, speaks of how warriors must sometimes choose a different kind of strength." Chogan picked up the broken arrow stone, feeling its familiar weight. As a young man, he had dismissed such lessons as old women's superstitions. Now, with the wisdom that comes from loss and loneliness, he understood their deeper truths. "You always said that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning," he said, "and you always argued that some things are too broken to mend." Itzel smiled. "Perhaps we were both right, perhaps both right and both wrong." "The children have changed me," Chogan admitted. "Caring for them has reminded me of who I was before grief made me forget. But I am not the same man who left here 7 years ago. I cannot be." "Good," Itzel said firmly. "That man was consumed by pain and anger. This man, the one who risks everything to protect innocence, this man we can welcome home." From across the canyon came the sound of Esperanza's laughter as she chased fireflies with her new friends. The sound was pure joy, unmarked by the trauma that had brought her here. Children, Chogan reflected, possessed a resilience that adults could only admire and try to protect. "Will they be safe here?" he asked. "As safe as any of us can be in these times," Itzel replied. "But safety is not just about hiding from danger. It is about belonging to something larger than ourselves, something worth defending. These children will belong here if we let them. The question is whether you will let yourself belong as well." The photograph appeared like a ghost from Chogan's buried past, discovered by Esperanza as she explored the dwelling Itzel had given them. It had fallen from an old leather pouch, yellowed and cracked at the edges, but still clear enough to tell its devastating story. "Chogan, look what I found!" Esperanza called out, holding up the faded image. "It's you, but you look different." Chogan's blood turned to ice as he saw what she held. In the photograph, a younger version of himself stood in cavalry uniform beside a flag and a group of soldiers. The insignia on his chest identified him as a scout, and his face bore the confident expression of a man who believed he served a righteous cause. Paloma looked up from mending her doll and studied the photograph with growing confusion. "You were a soldier, like the men who hurt our family." The question struck him like a physical blow. For 7 years, he had told himself that his past was buried, that the choices he had made in service to the army were separate from the man he had become. But now, faced with the innocent confusion in a child's eyes, he could no longer maintain that comfortable fiction. "Yes," he said quietly. "I was a scout for the cavalry. I led them through Apache territory and helped them track warriors who raided settlements. You helped them hunt your own people." Paloma's voice carried a note of betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. "I thought I was preventing a larger war," Chogan said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I believed that if we could capture the raiders quickly, fewer people would die on both sides. I told myself I was saving lives." Itzel appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices raised in distress. She took in the scene at a glance, the photograph in Esperanza's hands, the accusation in Paloma's eyes, the defeat written across Chogan's shoulders. "Ah," she said softly, "the past has decided to visit us." "You knew?" Paloma demanded. "You knew he was one of them." "I suspected. The way he moved, the way he read terrain, the military precision in how he made camp. These things suggested training that could not be learned from tribal teachers alone." Itzel settled herself cross-legged on the floor, her presence bringing a measure of calm to the charged atmosphere. But knowing someone's past and understanding their heart are different things entirely. Chogan took the photograph from Esperanza's small hands and stared at the stranger wearing his face. "There is more you should know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The raid that destroyed my village, that killed my family, I was the one who led the soldiers there." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant sound of children playing seemed to come from another world entirely. Paloma's face went pale, and even Esperanza seemed to sense that something terrible had been revealed. "I had been tracking a war party that had attacked a wagon train," Chogan continued, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had broken. "3 families killed, including children no older than you, Paloma. The trail led back toward my village, and my commanding officer ordered me to guide the soldiers there." He closed his eyes, but the memories came flooding back with perfect, torturous clarity. "I told them my family lived there, that there were innocents who had nothing to do with the raid. The captain said we would sort out the guilty from the innocent once we arrived. But when we got there," his voice broke, "when we got there, some of the younger soldiers were angry about their fallen comrades. They saw Apache faces and wanted revenge. The captain lost control of his men, and I—" He stopped, unable to continue. "What did you do?" Paloma asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer would bring more pain. "I tried to protect my family. I shouted warnings, fired shots in the air to alert the village. But it was too late. In the confusion, in the shooting, Aitana and Sitlali were caught in the crossfire. They died because of choices I made, paths I chose to walk." Esperanza moved closer to him, her child's instinct for comfort overriding the complexity of adult moral judgments. "Is that why you were so sad when we met you?" "Yes, little star. I carried the guilt of their deaths like stones in my heart. I left the army that day and never spoke to another white man for 2 years. I became the hermit you found in the desert, a man who had lost his way completely." Paloma remained silent for a long time, processing revelations that would have challenged someone twice her age. Finally, she spoke with the wisdom that trauma sometimes forced upon children. "The men who killed our family said they were soldiers too. They had uniforms and horses and orders, just like you did. But they were really just murderers using soldier clothes to hide what they were." She looked directly at him. "Are you a murderer, Chogan?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Itzel watched carefully, recognizing this as a moment that would define not just Chogan's relationship with the children, but his relationship with himself. "I have killed men," Chogan said slowly. "In war, in self-defense, to protect innocence. Some of those deaths were necessary. Others," he shrugged helplessly, "others I am not certain about. The line between warrior and murderer is not always as clear as we would like it to be." "But you saved us," Esperanza said with absolute certainty. "When the bad soldiers were chasing us, you made them stop. That was good killing, not bad killing, from the mouths of babes." Chogan felt tears burning behind his eyes at the child's. "Simple moral calculus. The past cannot be changed," Itzel said gently. "But the future remains unwritten. The man who led soldiers to raid villages is not the same man who risked everything to save 2 orphaned children. People change, grow, learn from their mistakes. The question is not who you were, but who you choose to be now." Paloma studied the photograph again, then looked at Chogan's face as if seeing him for the first time. "When you found us, you could have just ridden away. You didn't have to help. Why did you? Because I saw in your eyes the same pain I had carried for 7 years. And I realized that the only way to honor the memory of my own lost family was to prevent other children from feeling that pain." She nodded slowly, a decision crystallizing in her young mind. "Then I think you are not the same person as in this picture. That man looks proud. You look sorry. Sorry people try to do better." The wisdom of her words struck Chogan like lightning. In all his years of self-recrimination and exile, he had never thought of his guilt as a sign of moral growth. Rather than moral failure, Perhaps there was truth in what she said. Perhaps the very fact that he felt remorse proved that he had become someone better than the man he had been. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. Paloma exchanged a look with her sister, some silent communication passing between them. "Esperanza and I talked about forgiveness while you were making dinner last night. We decided that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending bad things didn't happen. It means choosing to believe that people can change. And we choose to believe in you," Esperanza added with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. As the sun set over the canyon walls, painting the adobe dwellings in shades of gold and crimson, Chogan felt something shift inside his chest. Not the crushing weight of guilt lifting entirely, but transforming into something more bearable. The past would always be with him, but perhaps it no longer had to define him. The photograph lay on the floor between them, a relic of choices that could not be undone. Tomorrow he would burn it and let the smoke carry his old self up to join the ancestors. Tonight he would begin the work of becoming the man these children believed him to be. The news came with the dawn, carried by a breathless young scout who had ridden through the night. A cavalry column was approaching the mountains, not the disorganized rabble of deserters they had dealt with before, but real soldiers under the command of a captain whose name made Chogan's stomach clench with dread. "Captain Morrison," the scout reported to the hastily assembled council. 40 men, well-armed, asking questions at every trading post and settlement about an Apache traveling with 2 white children. Morrison. The name conjured memories of a man with ice-blue eyes and a rigid sense of military honor that had often clashed with Chogan's more flexible approach to frontier justice. He had been a lieutenant when Chogan served as his scout, but 7 years was enough time for promotion and for old grievances to ferment into something darker. "How far?" Nazario asked. "Half a day's hard ride. They will be here by tomorrow evening. Perhaps sooner if they push their horses." The council erupted in urgent discussion. Some argued for scattering into the deep canyons where cavalry horses could not follow. Others wanted to prepare for a siege, trusting in their defensive positions and knowledge of the terrain. A few suggested that they should simply surrender, Chogan and the children, to avoid bringing war down upon the entire settlement. "Enough," Itzel said, her voice cutting through the debate like a blade. "This is not about military tactics or tribal survival. This is about what kind of people we choose to be when the world tests our principles." She turned to Chogan, who had remained silent throughout the discussion. "You know this Morrison?" "I know him. He was my commanding officer during the campaign that led to the destruction of our old village. A man who follows orders without question and expects the same from others. When I abandoned my post after..." He paused, unable to speak of his family's death. "After the tragedy, he took it as a personal betrayal. Will he listen to reason?" Chogan shook his head. "Morrison sees the world in absolute terms, good and evil, lawful and criminal, white and Apache. There are no gray areas in his moral universe. To him, I am a traitor who abandoned his duty and stole white children from their rightful place in civilization." "Then we fight," said one of the younger warriors, his hand moving to his knife. "If we fight, we all die," Chogan said quietly. 40 trained cavalry against maybe 15 men capable of bearing arms, with women and children to protect. The mathematics of war are not in our favor. "So we run?" Nazario asked. "No." Chogan stood, decision crystallizing in his mind with the clarity that came in moments of crisis. "I go to meet him alone. I face the consequences of my choices and hope that honor might move him where justice has failed." The council erupted in protest, but Chogan held up his hand for silence. "Morrison's quarrel is with me, not with you. If I surrender myself, he may be satisfied and leave the settlement in peace." "And the children?" Itzel asked. Chogan's jaw tightened. That was the heart of it, the choice that would define everything that followed. He could save the settlement by sacrificing himself, but Morrison would never allow Paloma and Esperanza to remain with the Apache. They would be taken back to some distant fort or mission, separated, placed with families who might be kind or might not, but who would never understand the journey that had brought them here. "I have to try," he said simply, as the council dispersed. To make preparations, Chogan found himself standing beside the stream that ran through the canyon's heart, watching the water flow over smooth stones worn by countless years of patient persistence. The metaphor was not lost on him. Perhaps redemption, like erosion, was a process that required time and consistent pressure rather than dramatic gestures. Paloma appeared beside him, having approached with the silent step she had learned during their journey through hostile territory. "You're going to leave us, aren't you?" There was no point in lying to her. "I am going to try to make it so that you and Esperanza can stay here where you are safe and loved. By giving yourself up to the soldiers, by facing the man I used to serve and hoping that some spark of the person he once was still exists beneath the uniform." She was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead with the patient intensity of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "When I was little, before everything happened, Papa used to tell me stories about knights who fought dragons to protect innocent people. I always wondered why the knights had to fight alone. Why didn't they bring friends to help?" "Because," Chogan said, understanding the question beneath the question, "some battles can only be fought by the person who needs to fight them. This is my dragon, Paloma. The mistakes I made, the guilt I carry, the man I used to be, these are things I must face alone. But you're not alone anymore," she said with quiet intensity. "You have us. You have Itzel and Nazario and all the people here who care about you. Maybe the reason knights in stories fight alone is because the storytellers forgot that real heroes have families worth fighting for." Her words struck him with unexpected force. For so long he had thought of himself as a solitary figure, carrying his burdens in isolation because that was what honor demanded. But perhaps true honor lay not in shouldering responsibility alone, but in accepting the help and love that others offered freely. That evening, as the settlement prepared for whatever the morning might bring, Chogan sat with Paloma and Esperanza. Outside their dwelling, helping them craft small figures from clay they had gathered by the stream. It was a simple activity, the kind of quiet domestic moment that had once defined his life with Aitana and Chitlali. "What are you making?" he asked. Esperanza, who was working with intense concentration on her small sculpture. "A bird," she said, holding up a rough but recognizable dove, "like Paloma's name. So when you go away, you can take it with you and remember that we want you to come back." The gift was offered with such innocent trust that Chogan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I will treasure it always, little star." "Mine is a horse," Paloma said, showing him her more detailed creation, "because horses always find their way home, even when the path is dark and dangerous." As the children worked, Chogan found himself thinking about legacy, not the kind written in blood and conquest, but the quieter kind that lived in small acts of kindness and love. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had given these children a chance. At life, at healing, at belonging to something larger than their trauma. Perhaps that was enough. Itzel joined them as the stars began to appear, her presence bringing the comfort of wisdom and experience. The young ones sleep peacefully. She observed, watching Paloma and Esperanza put the finishing touches on their clay figures. "They have learned to trust again," Chogan said. "That is a gift I never expected to be able to give. And what have they given you in return?" Chogan considered the question as he watched Esperanza carefully wrap her clay dove in a scrap of cloth. "Purpose," he said finally. "For 7 years I existed without truly living. They reminded me what it means to have something worth protecting, something worth becoming better for. Then regardless of what happens tomorrow, this journey has not been in vain." As the evening deepened, other members of the settlement came to offer their support. Nazario brought his old cavalry saber, cleaned and sharpened, suggesting that if diplomacy failed, they should at least meet force with force. Xochitl, despite her earlier skepticism, offered a medicine bundle blessed, with prayers for protection and clear judgment. Even the children of the village contributed, bringing small tokens, a feather for courage, a smooth stone for strength, a braid of sweetgrass for blessing. "You see," Paloma said as Chogan accepted each gift with gratitude, "knights don't have to fight alone. They choose to fight alone because they forget to ask for help." But even surrounded by this outpouring of support, Chogan knew that the final confrontation would ultimately come down to a conversation between two men who had once served together and now stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. Morrison would not be swayed by Apache warriors or heartfelt appeals from children. He would respond only to the language they had once shared, the code of military honor and duty that had shaped both their lives. From his saddlebags, Chogan withdrew the leather saber scabbard he had carried since his cavalry days. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the weapon that had marked his rank as a scout. Not the standard-issue blade carried by common soldiers, but a presentation sword given to him by his first commanding officer for exceptional service. He had not touched it since the day he deserted, but now he drew it slowly, feeling the familiar weight of the steel in his hand. The blade was still bright, the engraving still clear, for valor in service on one side, his name and the date of commission on the other. "What is that?" Paloma asked, drawn by the gleam of metal in the firelight. "A reminder of who I used to be," Chogan said, "and perhaps a bridge to who I might become." He spent the night in preparation, not just the practical arrangements of cleaning his weapons and checking his gear, but the spiritual preparation that Apache tradition demanded. Before facing life-or-death decisions, he sang the old songs softly, painted his face with the symbols his grandfather had taught him, and made peace with the possibility that tomorrow's sunset might find him walking the spirit trail. But as dawn broke over the canyon walls, painting the adobe dwellings in shades of gold and promise, Chogan felt something he had not expected: hope. Not the naive hope of the young or the desperate hope of the doomed, but the mature hope of a man who had found something worth living for and was prepared to fight for it with everything he possessed. Morrison was coming, and with him would come the reckoning that Chogan had been running from for 7 years. But he would not meet it as the broken, guilt-ridden hermit who had wandered the desert in exile. He would face it as a man who had learned that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about choosing to write a better future. The children were still sleeping when he prepared to leave, their faces peaceful in the early morning light. He kissed each of them gently on the forehead, a blessing and a promise that whatever happened, they would always carry a part of his love with them. The clay dove Esperanza had made for him rested securely in his medicine bundle, alongside the pottery shard from his wife's water jar and all the other treasures that connected him to both his past and his future. Today, he would discover whether love was stronger than law, whether honor could triumph over duty, and whether a man who had lost everything could still find a way to save what mattered most. The meeting place was a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by wind and water, where the echoes of spoken words could carry for miles. Chogan arrived first, as was proper for the man who had requested the parley, and sat cross-legged on a flat stone to wait for his former commander. Captain Morrison appeared at precisely noon, riding at the head of a column that moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers who had campaigned together for years. He was older than Chogan remembered, his blonde hair now touched with silver, and his face marked by the deep lines that came from squinting into too many hostile horizons. The captain dismounted 50 yards away and approached alone, as the rules of parley demanded. His hand rested casually on his saber hilt, but he made no overtly threatening gestures. This would be a conversation between professionals, conducted according to the courtesies that even enemies could observe. "Chogan," Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Or do you prefer your Apache name now that you've gone native? Chogan will do. It is who I have always been, underneath the uniform you gave me to wear." Morrison studied him with pale blue eyes that missed nothing: the traditional Apache clothing, the war paint, the weapons worn with casual familiarity. "You look well for a deserter and kidnapper. Frontier life apparently agrees with you." "I am no kidnapper. The children came with me by choice, fleeing from men who murdered their family. Men wearing United States Army uniforms, according to the reports I've received. Interesting coincidence, don't you think? First you abandon your sworn duty to serve with renegade Apache, and now you're found traveling with children whose parents were killed by soldiers." Morrison's tone remained conversational, but steel lurked beneath the surface. One might begin to see a pattern. Chogan felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he forced it down. Morrison was trying to provoke him, to justify whatever action he had already decided to take. Rising to the bait would serve no purpose, except to give the captain what he wanted. "The men who killed their family were deserters and criminals," Chogan said calmly. "I have proof of this, if you care to examine it." "Proof? What kind of proof could you possibly offer that I should trust?" From his medicine bundle, Chogan withdrew the papers he had taken from the false lieutenant's saddlebags: the map marking potential victims, the correspondence that revealed the scope of their criminal enterprise, the forged documents that had allowed them to masquerade as legitimate soldiers. Morrison examined the papers with the thoroughness of a man who had spent his career evaluating intelligence reports. His expression grew darker as he read, and when he finished, he looked at Chogan with something that might have been grudging respect. "These men were indeed criminals," he admitted, "but that doesn't change the fact that you're harboring white children who belong with their own kind, not running wild with Apache savages. Those children have names," Chogan said, his voice hardening despite his resolve to remain calm. "Paloma and Esperanza. They have suffered more in their short lives than most adults could endure, and they have found healing and safety among people you dismiss as savages." "Sentiment, Chogan. Pretty words that don't change the law or my duty." Morrison gestured toward his waiting soldiers. "I have orders to recover those children and return them to proper custody. You can make this easy or difficult, but the outcome will be the same." "And what of me?" Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "You'll face court-martial for desertion, of course, probably hang given the circumstances, but the children will be returned to civilization, where they belong." It was the answer Chogan had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. Morrison had not changed. He remained the rigid, uncompromising officer who saw the world in black and white, with no room for the complexities that defined life on the frontier. "I have a counter-proposal," Chogan said, reaching for the cavalry saber at his side. Morrison's hand moved to his own weapon, but he relaxed when he saw that Chogan was offering the blade rather than drawing it. "What is this?" "My commission sword, presented to me for valor in service to the United States Army." Chogan laid the weapon on the ground between them. "I am prepared to surrender myself and face whatever judgment you see fit on one condition. You're hardly in a position to make conditions. The children remain where they are. They have found a family that loves them, a place where they can heal from their trauma. Take me, but let them stay." Morrison stared at the sword for a long moment, then at Chogan's face. "You would sacrifice yourself for two white children who aren't even related to you. I would sacrifice myself for any children who needed protection. That is what you taught me back when we served together, that the strong have a duty to protect the weak, regardless of the cost. I taught you to follow orders and serve your country, not to make emotional decisions based on misguided sympathy. Maybe you taught me more than you realized." The silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon and the distant sound of horses shifting restlessly. Morrison's face was unreadable, But Chogan could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, duty warring with something that might once have been conscience. The standoff was broken by the sound of small feet on stone. Paloma and Esperanza appeared at the edge of the amphitheater, having followed Chogan despite his instructions to remain safely in the village. Behind them came Itzel and several other Apache, their faces grim but determined. "We told you to stay hidden," Chogan said, though his voice carried more concern than anger. "Knights don't fight dragons alone," Paloma replied, echoing their conversation from the night before. "And children don't let their families face danger without them." Morrison's attention shifted to the girls, and for the first time since the parley began, his rigid composure showed cracks. These were not the wild, half-savage creatures he had expected to find, but clean, well-cared-for children who moved with confidence and spoke with intelligence. "You must be Captain Morrison," Paloma said, approaching with the fearless directness that had carried her through every crisis of their journey. "Chogan told us about you. He said you used to be friends before you chose different paths." "We were never friends," Morrison replied, but his tone lacked its earlier steel. "We were soldiers who served together. That's different. Mama used to say that people who shared danger and trusted each other were the truest kind of friends, even if they didn't always agree about everything." Paloma's voice carried a maturity that made Morrison uncomfortable. She said friendship wasn't about always getting along, but about caring what happened to each other. "Your mother was wrong," Morrison said, but the words came out harsh and defensive. "Duty comes before personal feelings. Always." Esperanza, who had been hiding behind her sister, stepped forward and looked up at the captain with wide, curious eyes. "Are you here to take us away from Chogan?" The direct question, asked with such innocent trust, seemed to hit Morrison like a physical blow. "I'm here to return you to your own people," he said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "These are our people now," Esperanza said simply. "Chogan saved us when the bad soldiers hurt our mama and papa. Itzel teaches us stories and how to make medicine. The other children play with us and don't care that our skin is different. Why would we want to leave?" "Because," Morrison started, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the thought in a way that would make sense to a child. "Because they're white, and these people are Apache." Itzel asked, stepping forward with the dignity that came from a lifetime of leading others through impossible choices. "Captain, I have lived long enough to see many kinds of families. Blood families, chosen families, families born from love, and families destroyed by hatred. These children have found their place among us. Who are you to say that place is wrong?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "I'm an officer of the United States Army, charged with enforcing the law and maintaining order on the frontier. And what law sees that love recognizes skin color?" Itzel countered. "What order is served by tearing children away from people who would die to protect them?" "The natural order," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "White children belong with white families in civilization, not running wild in Apache camps." "Look at them," Chogan said quietly. "Really look at them, Morrison. Do they appear to be running wild? Do they seem neglected or abused? Or do they look like children who have found safety and healing after terrible trauma?" Morrison did look, and what he saw clearly troubled him. Paloma and Esperanza were clean, healthy, and confident. More confident, in fact, than many frontier children he had encountered in his years of service. They showed no signs of mistreatment or fear, except the wariness they displayed toward him and his soldiers. "This is irregular," he said finally, as if regulations could resolve the moral complexity of the situation. "The frontier is irregular," Chogan replied. "Survival out here requires adapting to circumstances that no regulation or manual could anticipate. You taught me that too, back when we served together." A commotion from the direction of Morrison's troops interrupted the conversation. One of the soldiers was approaching at a run, his face flushed with urgency. "Captain," the man called out, Urgent dispatch from Fort Bowie. Morrison took the message and read it quickly, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he finished, he looked up at Chogan with something that might have been relief. "It seems your story about the rogue soldiers has been corroborated," he said. "3 more homesteads hit by the same group, and survivors who described their leader as having a scarred face and blonde hair. The army is launching a full investigation into how deserters managed to operate for months using stolen uniforms and equipment." "Does this change things?" Paloma asked, hope creeping into her voice. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dispatch as if it might contain different words if he read it again. Finally, he folded the paper and looked directly at the children. "It changes some things," he said carefully. "If you were indeed victims of criminal activity rather than legitimate military action, then certain assumptions I made about your situation may have been incorrect." The feather fell from Chogan's hair as he knelt to embrace the children, a symbol of his warrior identity drifting away on the desert wind. What remained was simpler and more powerful. A man who had chosen love over law, family over duty, and hope over despair. 3 months after the confrontation that might have ended in bloodshed, but instead ended in understanding, the Apache settlement had found a new rhythm. Captain Morrison's decision to file a report stating that the children were appropriately placed with friendly Apache allies pending proper legal guardianship arrangements had bought them time to create something unprecedented, a legal adoption that bridged 2 worlds. Chogan sat outside the dwelling he now shared with Paloma and Esperanza, watching the morning sun paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose. The girls were learning to weave on a loom that Itzel had built for them, their blonde heads bent in concentration as they worked colored threads into patterns that told stories of their journey from despair to hope. "The blue thread represents the sky that watched over us during our travels," Paloma explained to her sister, pointing to a section of their work. "And the red is for the earth that gave us shelter." "What about the yellow?" Esperanza asked, carefully adding her own strand to the growing textile. "That's for the sun that brought us to our new family," Paloma said, glancing over at Chogan with a smile that still held traces of the serious child she had been forced to become, but also carried new notes of simple happiness. A rider approached from the south, and Chogan recognized the familiar figure of Carlos Santos from the trading post. The young man had become a regular visitor, carrying messages and supplies between the settlement and the outside world. More importantly, he had become a bridge between the Apache community and the Mexican-American families who were slowly learning to see them as neighbors rather than threats. "Buenos dias, abuelo," Carlos called out, using the affectionate term for grandfather that the children had taught him. It was a title that Chogan wore with pride, though it had taken time to accept that he could be a grandfather to children who were not of his blood. "Good morning, Carlos. What news do you bring today?" The young man dismounted and accepted a cup of coffee from Esperanza, who had appointed herself the official greeter of all visitors. "The territorial governor has signed the papers," he said. With a grin, "official recognition of the settlement as a legal entity with rights to trade and interact with other communities. And he paused dramatically, "formal acknowledgement of the adoption arrangements for Paloma and Esperanza." The news was better than Chogan had dared hope. For months, they had existed in a legal grey area, protected by Morrison's goodwill and the army's reluctance to create problems where none existed. But official recognition meant security, permanence, and the right to raise the children without fear of bureaucratic interference. "There's more," Carlos continued. "The new Indian agent, a man named Hayes, wants to meet with the council. He's apparently different from the others, a former teacher who actually believes in education and cooperation, rather than just containment." Itzel emerged from her dwelling, drawn by the sound of good news. "A teacher, you say? Interesting. Perhaps it is time to consider the school that Paloma's father dreamed of building." It was an idea that had been discussed often in recent weeks, using the stability of their new legal status to create something that had never existed before. A school that served both Apache and settler children, teaching them not just reading and arithmetic, but understanding and respect for each other's cultures. "I could teach," Paloma said eagerly. "I remember everything Papa taught me about letters and numbers. And I know Apache stories now too, thanks to its cell." "In a few years, little dove," Chogan said gently. "First, you must finish learning. Then, you can begin teaching others." As the day progressed, the settlement buzzed with the energy that comes when hope transforms from wish to reality. Plans were made, dreams were shared, and the future began to take concrete shape. Chogan found himself thinking often of the pottery shard he still carried in his medicine bundle, the fragment of Aitana's water jar that had survived the destruction of his first life. That evening, as the cooking fires were lit and families gathered for their evening meals, he withdrew the shard and showed it to Paloma and Esperanza. They had seen it before, but had never heard the full story of what it represented. "This was made by my first wife, the mother of my first daughter," he explained. "For years after they died, I carried this piece as a reminder of what I had lost. But I understand now that I was seeing it wrong." "How so?" Paloma asked, studying the painted patterns with the same attention she brought to her weaving. "I thought it was a fragment of something broken, a monument to destruction. But it's not. It's a seed of something beautiful, carrying the memory of love and skill forward into new creations." He gestured toward the loom, where their morning's work waited for tomorrow's continuation. "Just as your parents' love for you wasn't destroyed when they died, it lives on in the kindness you show others, the strength you've found, the family you've helped to create." Esperanza, now 6 years old and speaking Apache as fluently as English, touched the pottery shard with gentle fingers. "Can we make something new with it?" "What do you mean, little star?" "We could break it into smaller pieces and use them in our weaving like decorations. Then Mama Aitana and your first daughter would be part of our family too." The suggestion took Chogan's breath away. It was exactly the kind of wisdom that children possessed, the ability to see connections where adults saw only separation, to find ways to honor the past while building the future. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think they would like that very much." As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Chogan sat with his daughters, for that was what they were now, in every way that mattered, and felt the profound peace that comes when a man's life finds its proper shape. The warrior was still there, ready to protect those he loved, but he was no longer defined by violence and loss. He was a father, a teacher, a bridge between worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other. He was Chogan, whose name meant blackbird, a creature that could survive in many environments, adapting and thriving wherever it found itself. And most importantly, he was home.